My name is Jasmine, and I'm 24 years old now, but the memory of that humid July afternoon when I was 16 still makes my hands shake when I think about it. My grandfather Walter had always been what my mom called old school, the kind of man who believed that life's hardest lessons were the ones that stuck the best. But I never imagined he would take that philosophy as far as he did that day, abandoning me at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, 300 miles from home. I had been living with Walter for almost 2 years by then. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 14, and he was the only family I had left. His house in rural Tennessee was nothing like the suburban life I'd known in Nashville. Walter was a retired mechanic who lived by a strict code of self-reliance and what he called earning your keep. From the moment I moved in, he made it clear that I wasn't going to be coddled just because I was an orphan. The incident that led to my abandonment started 3 weeks before our trip to Alabama. Walter had given me $20 to buy groceries, enough for bread, milk, eggs, and maybe some cheap lunch meat. But walking through the store that day, I saw a group of girls from school buying candy and soda, laughing and having the kind of carefree moment I hadn't experienced since my parents died. On impulse, I spent $5 on a chocolate bar and a magazine, telling myself that Walter would never know. But Walter always knew. That night at dinner, he counted out every receipt item against his mental grocery list. When he discovered the discrepancy, his weathered face turned stone cold. "Jasmine," he said, setting down his fork with deliberate precision, "where's my $5? I tried to lie at first, claiming the prices had gone up, but Walter had been shopping at that same store for 20 years. He knew the price of everything down to the penny. Eventually, I broke down and confessed to buying the candy and magazine. I expected him to yell, to ground me, maybe even to make me pay him back from my tiny allowance. Instead, he just nodded slowly and said, "I see. Well, I reckon you've learned something important about yourself today." For 3 weeks after that, Walter treated me with a strange kind of distant politeness. He still cooked dinner and made sure I had what I needed for school, but there was a coldness in his interactions that made my skin crawl. He would look at me sometimes with this calculating expression, like he was working out a complicated math problem in his head. Then, on a sweltering Saturday in July, Walter announced we were taking a trip to visit his old army buddy in Birmingham, Alabama. I was excited. It would be my first time leaving Tennessee since moving in with him, and I thought maybe the trip would help us get back to normal. Walter seemed almost cheerful that morning as we loaded his old Ford pickup truck with our overnight bags. The drive started pleasantly enough. Walter told stories about his time in Vietnam, something he rarely discussed. He talked about the buddy we were visiting, a man named Eugene who had saved his life during a firefight near Da Nang. "Eugene's the kind of man you can trust with anything," Walter said, glancing at me meaningfully. "He knows the value of loyalty." We stopped for lunch at a small diner about 2 hours into the trip. Walter ordered us both the special, fried chicken with mashed potatoes and green beans. As we ate, he seemed almost nostalgic, telling me about road trips he'd taken with my grandmother before she died, back when my mom was young. "Your grandmother. Now she was a woman who understood respect," he said, sawing at his chicken with more force than necessary. "She knew that trust, once broken, had to be earned back." After lunch, we got back on the highway. The summer heat was oppressive, and the truck's air conditioning had given out years ago. We rode with the windows down, the hot wind whipping through the cab. About an hour later, Walter pulled off at a rest stop, just a small parking area with some picnic tables and restrooms, surrounded by thick pine forest. A faded sign read, "Welcome to Alabama," with bullet holes shot through the lettering. "Need to stretch my legs," Walter said, killing the engine. "You too, I'd imagine." I got out and walked around, grateful for the chance to move after hours of sitting. There were only 2 other vehicles in the parking area, a semi-truck with its driver napping in the cab, and an old station wagon with Alabama plates. Walter used the restroom, then came back to where I was sitting at one of the picnic tables. "Jasmine," he said, his voice carrying that same calculated tone he'd used for the past 3 weeks. "I want you to think real hard about that $5 you stole from me." "I didn't steal it, Walter," I protested. "I just bought something for myself." "I know I should have asked, but nothing," he cut me off. "You took money that wasn't yours and you lied about it. In my book, that's stealing, plain and simple." I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment and frustration. "Fine, okay, I stole $5. I'm sorry. I've already said I'm sorry 100 times." Walter studied my face for a long moment. then nodded slowly. "I believe you are sorry, Jasmine. Sorry you got caught anyway. But being sorry isn't the same as learning your lesson." He walked back to the truck and got behind the wheel. I assumed he was ready to continue our trip, so I jogged over and reached for the passenger door handle. But as soon as I touched it, Walter hit the gas and pulled forward about 10 feet, leaving me standing there confused. "Walter?" I called out, walking toward the truck again. "What are you doing?" He rolled down the window and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something colder and more frightening. "You want to know what it feels like to be abandoned, Jasmine? To have someone you trust leave you behind?" My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Walter, this isn't funny." "I'm not laughing," he said. "You see, when you stole that money and lied to me about it, you abandoned your principles. You abandoned the trust I placed in you. Now you're going to learn what abandonment really feels like." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're not serious. You're not actually going to leave me here." "I am indeed," Walter said, his voice as steady as if he were discussing the weather. "This is what we call a teaching moment, granddaughter. You're going to sit here in this rest stop and think about what it means to be trustworthy. When you've figured that out, maybe you'll find your way home." "Walter, please," I begged, reaching toward the truck window. "I'm 16 years old. I don't have any money. I don't even know where we are. You're about 40 miles outside of Montgomery," he said matter-of-factly. "Smart girl like you, I'm sure you'll figure something out. Maybe this will teach you to think before you act." I was crying now, hot tears streaming down my face in the oppressive heat. "This is insane. You can't just leave me here." "Can't I?" Walter put the truck in drive and started to pull away slowly. "You made your choice when you stole from me, Jasmine. Now I'm making mine." I ran alongside the truck for a few feet, pounding on the passenger window. "Walter, please, I'm sorry. I'll pay you back. I'll do anything." But he didn't stop. I watched in growing horror as his truck pulled out of the rest stop and back onto the highway, disappearing around a curve in the road. The sound of the engine faded, leaving me alone with the distant hum of traffic and the oppressive silence of the Alabama wilderness. For the first few minutes, I convinced myself this was some kind of sick joke. Walter was probably just driving around the block to scare me. He would come back any minute, probably laughing at how terrified I looked. But as those minutes stretched into an hour, then 2 hours, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was completely alone, with no money, no phone. This was 2008, and while some kids my age had cell phones, Walter considered them unnecessary luxuries. I had no way to contact anyone, and even if I could, who would I call? Walter was my only family. My parents' friends from Nashville had sent sympathy cards after the funeral, but I hadn't spoken to any of them in 2 years. The rest stop had a payphone, but it was broken, the receiver dangling by a frayed cord. The semi-truck driver had woken up and driven away while I was still processing what Walter had done. The station wagon left an hour later, leaving me completely alone as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. As evening approached, I realized I needed to make a plan. The rest stop had outdoor lighting, but it was sparse, and the surrounding forest grew darker and more ominous as night fell. I found a relatively clean spot near the building and tried to figure out my options. I could try to hitchhike, but Walter had drilled into me the dangers of accepting rides from strangers. I could try to walk, but I had no idea which direction led to civilization, and the thought of wandering through the Alabama wilderness in the dark terrified me. That first night was the longest of my life. Every sound from the forest made me jump. The hoot of owls, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the distant howl of what might have been a coyote. I dozed fitfully, leaning against the concrete wall of the restroom building, jerking awake every few minutes in panic. By morning, I was dehydrated, exhausted, and beginning to understand the true cruelty of what Walter had done. This wasn't a lesson about the $5 anymore. This was something much darker, a deliberate attempt to break me psychologically, to make me understand my complete dependence on his goodwill. A trucker stopped around 7 a.m. and found me huddled by the building. His name was Dave, and he was probably in his 50s, with kind eyes and a Memphis accent. "You okay, honey?" he asked, approaching cautiously. "You look like you've been here all night." I broke down and told him everything. About my parents, about living with Walter, about the $5 and his twisted lesson. Dave listened with growing anger, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's not teaching," he said firmly. That's abuse. Pure and simple. Come on, let's get you something to eat and figure out how to get you home safe. Dave took me to a truck stop about 10 miles down the road and bought me breakfast, the first food I'd had since lunch the previous day. While I ate, he made some phone calls. It turned out Dave had a daughter about my age, and the thought of someone abandoning her the way Walter had abandoned me made him furious. "I've got a load going to Nashville," he said after finishing his calls. "I can drop you off there," and I called ahead to the police. "They're going to meet us and help you figure out what to do next." The ride to Nashville gave me hours to think about everything that had happened. Dave was careful not to push me to talk, but when I did open up, he listened without judgment. He told me about his own difficult childhood with an alcoholic father, and how he'd learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones who hurt us most. "What your grandfather did," he said, as we crossed into Tennessee. "That wasn't about $5. That was about power, about showing you that he could hurt you whenever he wanted, and there wasn't anything you could do about it." When we reached Nashville, true to his word, Dave had arranged for a police officer to meet us. Officer Martinez was a woman in her 30s, who specialized in cases involving minors. She listened to my story with professional composure, but I could see the anger in her eyes. "We're going to need to contact your grandfather," she said after I finished explaining everything. "And we're going to need to involve Child Protective Services. What he did was criminal abandonment of a minor." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and paperwork. When they finally reached Walter, his response shocked everyone, including me. He claimed that I had run away during our trip, that he had spent hours looking for me before reluctantly continuing home, assuming I would contact the authorities when I was ready. "He's lying," I told Officer Martinez desperately. "He drove away and left me there on purpose. He said it was to teach me a lesson." "I believe you," she said firmly, "and we're going to prove it." It took 3 days, but the investigation uncovered security camera footage from a gas station near the rest stop. The cameras clearly showed Walter's truck pulling in with me visible in the passenger seat, then leaving with the passenger seat empty. When confronted with this evidence, Walter finally admitted to what he had done, but he showed no remorse. "That girl needed to learn respect," he told the social worker assigned to my case. "Sometimes tough love is the only kind that works." The court disagreed. Walter was charged with criminal abandonment and child endangerment. I was placed in foster care with a family in Nashville, the Hendersons, who were kind, patient people who understood what I had been through. But the story doesn't end there, because 3 months later, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about my grandfather Walter. I was cleaning out my belongings from his house. The court had ruled that I could retrieve my personal items with a social worker present, when I found a box hidden in the back of his bedroom closet. Inside were documents that revealed a secret Walter had kept for decades. My grandfather Walter, the man who had abandoned me to teach me about trust and loyalty, had been living under a false identity for over 30 years. His real name was William Carver, and he was wanted for desertion from the Army during the Vietnam War. The Walter Jameson identity was completely fabricated, stolen from a man who had died in infancy in 1946. Everything he had ever told me about his military service, about his buddy Eugene in Birmingham, about his honorable discharge, all of it was lies. But the discoveries didn't stop there. The box contained correspondence with multiple women across the South, all of whom believed they were in exclusive relationships with him. There were love letters, photographs, even receipts for engagement rings he had purchased for at least 4 different women over the past decade. Walter, or rather William, had been systematically deceiving everyone in his life for years. The man who had punished me so severely for stealing $5 and lying about it had built his entire existence on fraud and deception. The most shocking revelation came in the form of bank statements showing that he had been receiving monthly payments from 3 different women, all of whom apparently believed they were supporting their loving boyfriend through his medical treatments. The total amount was over $4,000 per month, money he had been hoarding in secret accounts. The social worker, Mrs. Patterson, was as stunned as I was. "Jasmine," she said, looking through the documents, "did you have any idea about any of this?" I shook my head, still trying to process what we had found. He always said he lived simply because he was on a fixed income from his military pension. He made me feel guilty for every penny I spent because he said money was tight. "According to these bank records," Mrs. Patterson said grimly, "he was taking in more money each month than most families make in a year, and he was letting you go without things you needed." The investigation into Walter's true identity opened up a whole new can of worms. The FBI became involved because of the military desertion and identity theft. The women he had been deceiving were contacted, and several of them pressed charges for fraud. It turned out that William, had been running these romance scams for decades, moving from town to town when things got too complicated. 2 weeks after these revelations came to light, I received a phone call that left me speechless. It was from a woman named Carol in Birmingham, Alabama, the same Birmingham where Walter had claimed we were going to visit his army buddy Eugene. "I think you need to know the truth about your grandfather," Carol said, her voice shaky with emotion. "I've been sending him money for 3 years because he told me he needed help taking care of his orphaned granddaughter. He said you had special medical needs and that his military pension wasn't enough to cover your treatments." My blood ran cold. "What kind of medical needs?" "He said you had a rare neurological condition that required expensive medications. He sent me pictures of you. They looked like they were taken without you knowing. He said you were too proud to accept charity, so the help had to come through him." I felt sick to my stomach. Not only had Walter been exploiting these women's kindness, but he had been using my tragedy, the loss of my parents, my vulnerable situation, as a tool to manipulate them into sending money. "How much money?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Over the past 3 years, probably around $30,000, Carol said quietly. I thought I was helping save a child's life. The full scope of Walter's deception was staggering. He had been using my story, a real orphan teenager living in poverty with her grandfather, to con multiple women out of their life savings. While I was scraping together coins to buy school supplies and wearing clothes from thrift stores, he was stockpiling money that people had donated specifically for my care. The psychological impact of these discoveries was almost worse than the original abandonment. Everything I had believed about my life with Walter was a lie. The financial struggles I had thought we were facing together were fabricated. The lessons about integrity and honesty had come from a man whose entire existence was built on fraud. But perhaps the cruelest irony was the lesson he had tried to teach me about trust. Walter had abandoned me in the middle of nowhere, putting my life at risk, all because I had impulsively spent $5 without asking. Yet he had been stealing thousands of dollars from innocent people while using my personal tragedy as his calling card. The legal proceedings took months to unfold. William, was eventually sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for identity theft, fraud, and child endangerment. The women he had deceived were able to recover some of their money from his hidden accounts, though much of it was gone. As for me, the Hendersons had become more than foster parents. They had become the family I needed. Mrs. Henderson, Margaret, was a retired teacher who understood the trauma I had experienced. Mr. Henderson, James, was a social worker himself, who helped me navigate the complex emotions of betrayal and abandonment. "What Walter did to you," Margaret told me one evening as we worked together in their garden, "it says nothing about your worth as a person. It says everything about his character, or lack thereof." "But I did steal that money," I said, still grappling with guilt. "Maybe if I hadn't—" "Jasmine, stop," she interrupted firmly. "A normal grandfather would have sat you down and explained why taking the money was wrong. He might have given you extra chores to earn it back, or made you write an apology letter. He wouldn't have abandoned a child in the wilderness. What he did was cruel and criminal, regardless of what you did first. The healing process was long and complicated. I had nightmares for months, sometimes about that night alone at the rest stop, sometimes about Walter's cold eyes as he drove away. But slowly, with the help of therapy and the unwavering support of the Hendersons, I began to rebuild my sense of trust and safety. I also began to understand that Walter's abandonment of me wasn't really about teaching me a lesson. It was about control, about demonstrating his power over me, about making sure I understood exactly how precarious my position in his life really was. It was psychological warfare disguised as parenting. The discovery of his double life only reinforced this understanding. Walter was a predator who had targeted vulnerable people, the lonely women he seduced and defrauded, and the orphaned granddaughter he controlled through fear and manipulation. He had used my dependence on him as a weapon, knowing that I had nowhere else to go. 2 years after the rest stop incident, I received a letter from Walter in prison. The Hendersons had legally adopted me by then, giving me the stability and love that Walter had systematically withheld. When the letter arrived, I had to decide whether to read it or throw it away unopened. I chose to read it, and I wish I hadn't. Even from prison, Walter was still trying to manipulate me. The letter was full of justifications for his actions and complaints about how unfairly he was being treated. He claimed that everything he had done was for my own good, that I would understand when I was older how much he had sacrificed for me. There was no genuine apology, no acknowledgement of the trauma he had caused, no recognition that his actions had been criminal. Instead, he painted himself as a misunderstood man who had been trying his best to raise a difficult child under impossible circumstances. The letter ended with a request that I put money in his prison commissary account and visit him when he was released. I tore the letter into pieces and threw it in the trash. Margaret found me crying in the kitchen afterward and held me while I grieved. Not for Walter, but for the grandfather I had thought I had, the one who had never really existed. "You don't owe him anything," she said firmly. "Not money, not visits, not forgiveness. You don't owe him a single thing." Now, at 24, I can look back on those experiences with a clarity that I couldn't have had as a 16-year-old girl alone at that rest stop. Walter's abandonment was traumatic and cruel, but it also freed me from his toxic influence. If he hadn't shown his true nature so dramatically, I might have spent years more under his psychological control, gradually being worn down by his manipulation and abuse. The discovery of his double life was shocking, but it also validated everything I had sensed about him: the coldness beneath his lessons about integrity, the way he seemed to enjoy watching me struggle, the calculated nature of his cruelty. He wasn't a flawed grandfather trying his best. He was a con artist who had seen me as just another mark to exploit. I've built a good life for myself now. I graduated from college with a degree in social work, inspired partly by Officer Martinez and Mrs. Patterson, who had showed me what it looked like when adults actually protect children. I work with teenagers in foster care, many of whom have experienced abandonment and betrayal by the people who were supposed to love them. I married a wonderful man named David last year, someone who understands my history and has never once made me feel like I have to earn his love or loyalty. We're talking about starting a family, and I know that when we do, our children will grow up understanding that love is unconditional, that trust is sacred, and that adults who hurt children under the guise of teaching lessons are abusers, not teachers. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Dave the trucker hadn't stopped at that rest stop, if Officer Martinez hadn't taken my case seriously, if the Hendersons hadn't opened their home to a traumatized teenager. But then I remember that Walter's plan was never really about teaching me independence or resilience. It was about breaking me down so completely that I would never question his authority again. He failed. Instead of breaking me, his cruelty freed me to find people who actually cared about my well-being. Instead of teaching me to be grateful for his conditional love, he showed me what unconditional love looked like by contrast. The last I heard, Walter was released from prison about a year ago. He's on parole and living in a halfway house in Georgia. Sometimes I worry that he might try to contact me, but I have a restraining order, and I've changed my last name to Henderson. If he wants to find me, he'll have to work at it, and frankly, I don't think he cares enough to try. That abandoned rest stop is still there, by the way. I drove past it 2 years ago while visiting a college friend in Alabama. It looks exactly the same cracked pavement, the same bullet-riddled welcome sign, the same sense of isolation, but seeing it again didn't bring back the terror I had expected. Instead, I felt something like gratitude. That rest stop was where my real life began, not the life Walter had planned for me, one of fear and dependence and constant gratitude for crumbs of affection. The life I chose for myself, surrounded by people who love me without conditions, and who would never, ever, abandon me to prove a point. Walter thought he was teaching me about trust that day. In a way, he did. He taught me that trust should never be weaponized, that love should never come with the threat of abandonment, and that the people who claim to be teaching you the hardest lessons are often the ones you need to learn to live without. Do you think I was right to cut all contact with Walter after discovering his double life? I'd love for you to subscribe to hear more stories like this one, and let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Thank you so much for listening to my story.